I wonder if you look back at this week, what you spent most of your time thinking about. I think sometimes that a question like that can be a little bit embarrassing if you try to answer it, if we're honest. What did I think about? And not always just because our thoughts are so sinful, but sometimes, a lot of times, because they were so trivial. How much of our life do we spend thinking about what we're going to wear or what other people think of us or what we're going to have for dinner? Or sports, like why can't the Sixers get their act together? I spend way too much time thinking about that. But we all have different trivial things we spend time thinking about. But one very common thing that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about is money, maybe even more than we realize. I wonder how much of your week did you spend thinking about money? And I know that at first some of us might hear that question and feel guilty almost right away, like, yeah, I know I think too much about money. But of course, on the other hand, some of us might feel pretty good because we don't think that much about money. Maybe we're like, I'm not like those other people. I hardly ever think about money, as if that automatically were a good thing. Because I think at least some of us tend to feel like it's unspiritual to think about money or talk about money. We see some people think about money too much, and so we think the solution must be not to think about money. As long as we're not thinking about money, we're fine. But the reality is that it's not quite that simple. We can be unspiritual in the way we think about money, for sure, but it's not always necessarily unspiritual to think about money. In fact, sometimes it can be unspiritual not to think about money. To be spiritual, we need to think about how we use money. And we know that because we open our Bible and we look down at a gospel like Luke and we see that Jesus clearly wants us to do some thinking about money. That is part of the purpose of this passage. Actually, this whole chapter, Luke 16. Jesus has just explained the cost of discipleship at the end of chapter 14, where he says, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. And so he's calling for a very particular relationship with money. We have to say that it's not ours if we're going to follow him, which is intense. And yet at the beginning of chapter 15, we see there are still a lot of people who are coming to be one of his disciples. And many of them are people who would have had some money, especially those who were tax collectors. And after explaining to the Pharisees why he's so happy to associate with people like that, why he thinks it's a good thing, now Jesus is talking to people who are on his side, his followers. Luke 16, verse 1, he writes, he also said to the disciples. And you know what he's back to talking to them about now? He's talking to them about the way they handle money. This is a big discipleship issue according to Jesus. And he tells a story, you remember, in verses 1 through 8, whose main point is that if he's doing what he is saying that he's doing, they need to be wiser about how they're using their money. And you remember maybe how it goes. But Jesus brings up this illustration of a dishonest manager. That's the word he uses for him in verse 8, the dishonest manager. Do you see that maybe if you look down? But that word dishonest is literally the word unrighteous. And I don't know why they translate it dishonest exactly. It's adikia, meaning not or without, and dikia, righteousness. So it's weird that they translate it dishonest to me. This is an unrighteous manager. And what is unrighteous about him? Because I know if you remember the story from the past couple weeks, we might interpret what he did in verses 6 and 7 as unrighteous. Because you remember he talks to the master's debtors and he changes how much they owe the master, and we automatically think of that as stealing. And it might be that's what's going on, but also it might not be, because there's a lot we actually don't know about the authority this particular manager had. And so maybe he did have the right to do that. Managers at different stores, even now, I imagine, have different levels of authority for what happens at their store. And it's not so far-fetched to think that it wasn't totally wrong for him to do that, actually, if you look at the way the master responds after he does. Because what does the master do in verse 8? He doesn't get upset. He commends him or praises him. And so we don't know that what he did there was wrong, but what we do know for sure that the master thought he was doing wrong is found back up in verse 1. And what does the master say there? He says, this man was wasting his possessions. So he wasn't using his master's resources for his master's benefit. And that was what was unrighteous about him. And that failure caused a crisis at the beginning. Verse 2, the master was about to fire him, but when the servant found out what was going to happen, he changed. He made a plan to use those resources more wisely, and the master said, good job at the end. And Jesus basically says to his disciples, you need to look at whether or not you've been wasting God's resources, because wasting God's resources is unrighteous. That is unrighteous wealth. And if you have not been using the resources God has given you wisely, and you really believe that Jesus is going to establish an eternal kingdom and judge the wicked and reward his people, then you need to make a plan not to keep on wasting God's resources. And you can make that plan because you look out there at the world, and even unbelievers are smart enough to figure out how to use money more wisely when they start thinking about their future. And if they do all that thinking about something as insignificant as their own security for the next few years, how much more should believers learn to think wisely about using their money for what is of greater significance? Eternal significance. Jesus says, end of verse 8, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, and he goes on to say, this is how you need to use your money now. That's what he talks about next. And we've been seeing the past few weeks a couple of different reasons it's so important we listen to Jesus and what he says about using our money wisely, for the purpose of actually doing something different, like actually changing. And I'm afraid that we sometimes listen to Jesus for the purpose of justifying what we're doing already, not for changing, especially when it comes to subjects about money. I'm afraid that we don't always come with the intention of actually doing anything different, because we've got so many justifications for what we're already doing. And the people around us are so happy to give us different justifications for what we're already doing. But that is what the Pharisees do, right? Verse 15, Jesus talks to the Pharisees who were lovers of money, and he said, you are those who justify yourselves before men. We want to listen to Jesus for the purpose of being different in the way we use money, for a number of reasons. The first one being that money is a tool, and we looked at this several weeks ago now. But in verse 9, Jesus starts applying the story that he tells and says, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. And you see the connection between what you do with money now and what happens in eternity there. And that's a connection Jesus makes a number of places, because it seems like what's happened is that God in his kindness has given us an opportunity to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven by investing our money here on earth well. And so if we're concerned about eternity, like we believe in eternity, we need to think about money, because it's a tool. And the thing is, it's also a test, because there is actually a right and wrong way to use money. Somehow you can lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven through your use of your resources, and having that eternal perspective when it comes to money isn't a suggestion from Jesus in verse 9. This is a command. Jesus commands his followers to make friends for themselves by use of unrighteous wealth. And you know, he's talking about sacrificial generosity to the needy, primarily there. This is a matter of disobedience if we don't do that. You could say it's unrighteous. And Jesus does in verse 10. He says, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is unrighteous, that's the word, unrighteous in a very little, is also unrighteous in much. And the very little that he's talking about is money. The way you use money is so important, not because money is so important, but because there's a correlation between biblical generosity and your character. And there's a correlation between a lack of biblical generosity and your character as well. And that's a theme in the Bible, actually. If we could see things from God's perspective, we would see that a lack of biblical generosity is wicked. I remember one time going through every section of the Bible and noting everything that I could find that it said about generosity to the poor and how often it correlated generosity to the poor with righteousness and a lack of generosity with wickedness. And it's overwhelming. It gets tiring once you start writing down all those passages, actually. And it can be challenging when you look at passages like Isaiah 58 or Luke 16 to think about the way we use money. It can be certainly convicting. I was at Disneyland this week. We were given some money for the purpose of taking the foster kids places, and so we were able to take one of them to Disneyland. And it's just amazing to look around and think about how much money is being spent on stuff there. And the goal is not to be everybody's judge, but if there is an unrighteous and righteous way to use money, we need to at least think about the way we're using money. It's possible that a continual spending of God's resources on yourself that is unrighteous. It's an issue for sure that says something about who we really are. It's a tool, and it's a test, and it's also a threat, and this is where we're at today. This is verse 13. Jesus says, no servant can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And you know, this is a really important verse. It's big. It is so clearly important to Jesus because it's something that he says more than once. He says it in different places, almost the same exact thing in different sermons. And it's a warning. Here it's kind of like an exclamation point on this whole subject. This is how important this whole issue is. This is why it's important. This is why you need to take what Jesus is saying about money so seriously. It can be super dangerous. And today I want to talk about why. I want us to think about this verse a little. We see here a problem with money. What makes it a threat? That's number one. Why is money dangerous? And if it's dangerous like that, then second, number two, we need to think about how to evaluate if we're in danger. And then finally, if we're not doing well, we see that we failed the evaluation, or at least we recognize the danger. The third thing we need to think about is how do we protect ourselves from this threat? This is something I thought about moving back to the United States. Thought about a lot. Moving my family here is dangerous because of this particular threat. And so I want to think about why it's a threat, how to know if we're in danger, and how do we protect ourselves. But first of all, as we look at this text, let's start with what makes money dangerous. If we just think carefully about what Jesus says here, no servant can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. I think we'll see the problem with money. But before we unpack that, I probably should make clear the problem with money is not money, obviously, which I'm guessing you already know. But I know that I need to hear that anyway, because I can be a person of extremes. And I'm sure other people are like me in that we see something's a problem, and it's tempting to start thinking the solution must just be doing the exact opposite. which usually creates other problems instead. And so we might see people having all these problems with money, and they do, for sure. And we might think that money in and of itself is somehow the problem, and that the solution must be not having money, as if it were more biblical not to have money, as if you're poor and you're automatically righteous. And I honestly can see some things that are attractive about that. And in the past, that's the kind of error that I could easily make. I don't know if I made it, but I could see being tempted to make that kind of mistake, to maybe feel like I'm more holy and don't have as much problems with money if I don't have much money. Or on the other hand, and this is probably more the issue, at least for me, feel like I'm unholy and automatically have problems with money if I do happen to have some. But that way of thinking is too simplistic, because money in and of itself, and you can put under that possessions and houses and cars and all that stuff, is all part of the created order. And so it's not in and of itself bad, and it's actually meant to be enjoyed. And so you're reading Luke, and yes, sometimes Jesus tells people to sell it all. And you can get the impression maybe that Jesus is anti-money. But then you look a little closer, and he doesn't always tell people that. And we don't want to get too into it, but Luke is one of the books in the Bible that sounds the most intense about money, if you were going to pick a book. Like, it sounds a little different than what you see in Proverbs, for example. But even in Luke and Acts, it's a little more complicated than just money's bad, get rid of everything. And here's just one example. There's a bunch. If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it sometime. But if you remember, maybe back at the beginning of Luke chapter 5, Jesus calls Peter and James and John to follow him. And Luke tells us they listened and they left everything. Luke 5, verse 11. And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. And it seems like Luke is including that story here as kind of a paradigm for discipleship. This is what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. And so we might think, okay, that's what we need to do. Sell everything. And if that's what Jesus means, we totally should. Just hear that. Like, look, if Jesus wants us to sell everything, we should sell everything. But we have to think, is that what Jesus wants for all of us? Because even later in that same chapter, he calls Levi to follow him. And in the next verse, Luke chapter 5, verse 28, Luke says he did. Leaving everything, he rose and followed him. And so Levi did what Peter and James and John did. But right after that, you know what Luke 5, verse 29 says? It says, and Levi made him a great feast in his house. And so it seems like even though he left everything, he still had a house and he still had stuff to throw a party with. And so I don't think renouncing all for everybody means selling all the time, or that for Jesus having possessions is always a bad thing. Jesus isn't anti-enjoyment of stuff, and that wouldn't make sense. If you look back at God's original design for the world, God designed this world to be enjoyed. And if you look forward to God's future design, what is eternity going to be like? I don't know if there's going to be money there, but there are going to be things, and everyone there is going to be prosperous. And so prosperity clearly can be a blessing. But the emphasis is on can be, because honestly, a lot of times it isn't. Jonathan Edwards once preached a sermon, sometimes God gives those he hates prosperity. Because a lot of times prosperity causes a lot of problems. In fact, I think one of the ways we see the wickedness of the human heart, just how broken we are, is how often we take something good, like an actual blessing that God gives for our joy, and we twist it into something that does us great harm. And that's really the issue, and what makes this such an important subject to talk about, because money is not evil in and of itself, but people get money, and it sure does seem like it often does a great amount of spiritual damage to them. And that's why there are so many cautions like this one Jesus is giving all throughout the Bible. We see people doing all kinds of very bad things with this good thing, money. And there's often a clear association between them having the good thing and doing the bad thing. And so it's not coincidental. There's a definite connection between money and the very bad things that they're doing. And I probably don't need to give you too many examples because you've seen this. But here's this guy who seems normal until you put him in a situation with money. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, who are you anymore? Because he's doing things that you would have never imagined he would do. So like, for example, the Bible talks about people trading their integrity for money. And so you got this person who you normally would think would be concerned about his reputation and being honest, and yet when he gets near money, the opportunity for money, he's willing to throw all that away and lie to other people to get it. In Proverbs, Solomon talks about unequal weights or a false balance. Proverbs 11:1. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, which is someone messing with these machines purposefully to be able to charge someone else more than what they're selling to actually worth. In other words, they're willing to risk their reputation, their honesty, for making themselves just a little more money. And obviously it gets worse because there are people who are ruthless for money. You get near them and they're literally willing to hurt other people to get it. Amos 5:11 says, you trample on the poor and you exact taxes of grain from him for the purpose of building yourself these luxurious houses. In Nehemiah, actually, you have people who saw their fellow Jews, and this is like their family. That's how they were trained to think. They saw their fellow Jews needing food desperately because they were in a desperate situation. And so they upped the price so they could get more money, which made the poor people who were hungry and needing food have to sell their sons and daughters into slavery to get money to buy the food they needed to survive. And I mean, this is crazy. Here's this human who's in a position that's vulnerable, which should create in you feelings of compassion, and you have the resources to help them, but for the sake of getting just a little more money, a person thinks the opposite. He thinks, this is awesome because I can take advantage now of this person more easily to make more money for myself to buy something that I don't even need right now. And you know, that's real. That's so real. When we worked in South Africa, so many of the people who had come to seek asylum, the way that people took advantage of them when it came to rent or housing deposits was just insane. And we could go on and on about the things people do for money. You see people making money, you see people making what you would consider idiotic choices for money. It's like their brain goes out the window if there's a possibility of money nearby. You can almost get people to do anything for money. Think of the most ridiculous thing there is. You could start a YouTube channel probably. Think of the most ridiculous thing there is. Somebody will do that for money. And then you'll make money with people watching the YouTube channel. But people will change for money. People will treat other people differently for money. In James, a rich man comes into the church, and they don't know anything about him except for the clothes and the rings he's wearing. And they're like, oh, and everybody's running up to him to show him such favor. And then a poor person comes in, and just by his clothes, they totally ignore him. Money gets people to think crazy thoughts about themselves. It tends to shrink your heart, but it also tends to inflate your head. A rich man, Proverbs 28:11 says, is wise in his own eyes. And this is something funny I heard somebody say that I had never thought about before, but with most things that you're smart about, you know that being smart in one area doesn't make you smart about everything. And nobody treats you like that either. Like if somebody fixes your car, you're not like, you know what, I've got this problem with my kids. I see you did a good job like with my engine. Could you just give me some advice? But with money, if somebody's smart about making money, or even if they just have a little money, it's tempting to think they're somehow smarter about everything else. You're talking to somebody, and suddenly you find out he's really rich, and suddenly it's like, oh, their opinions on all these subjects becomes more significant. Like, gotta be careful. In Africa, it used to be the culture, age mattered a lot. And it still does, but things are changing. Money can even trump age now. And so you have a poor older person and a rich younger person, and people will respect the rich younger person more. They have a big thing about the older brother, but if a younger brother has money, he suddenly becomes like the older brother in the family sometimes. So obviously, money by itself is not bad. We know that. It can be a blessing and all that. But still, the reality is that if you put people near money and see what happens, it's clearly dangerous. And it's like, what does that? Why? Why does that happen over and over and over again? Which is part of what makes Jesus says to his disciples here in Luke 16, verse 13, so important, because it's essentially a warning. It's a statement: no servant can serve two masters, for he'll either hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. But in this context, it's definitely also a warning. As Jesus is telling his disciples to think about money, he's like, hold up, watch out as you do, because there's this reality that makes money very dangerous. Money's just a piece of paper. But there's something we're tempted to do with money that makes it a spiritual threat. We're tempted to make money a god. And once money becomes our God, the true God isn't. I think that's essentially what Jesus is saying. We are tempted to make money a god. And once money becomes our God, the true God isn't. And this is connected back to a really important biblical insight just in general. You don't just do things as a human being. You do things for a reason. And while you might not always even recognize the reason, there is a reason. You have something that motivates you. And one picture Jesus uses to describe that is of you being like a servant, serving a certain master. And so you're doing things, but why are you doing those things? It's because you're a servant. You're serving a certain master who's telling you what to do. And the thing is, we all have masters telling us what to do. Another description for what I'm talking about might be gods. We all have gods. You see, Jesus uses the word serve here. He says, no servant can serve two masters. But he could have said, no man can worship two gods just as easily, because it's the same idea. Serve and worship, those words are connected in the Bible. What you serve, biblically speaking, what you organize your life around, what calls the shots at the end of the day, what motivates you, what determines what decisions you make is what you worship. Not just what you say you worship on Sundays, but who you serve. You serve what you worship, and you worship what you serve. In other words, there is something in your life that you look to as master and God, that you put your faith in, that you put your trust in, that you say, this is going to accomplish good for me. This is going to protect me in the future. This is going to provide security for me. This is going to provide an identity for me. And that's really what is God to you. That's your master. That's who you're going to serve. A long time ago, Martin Luther said, a God is a term for that which we are to look to for all good and in which we are to find refuge. And so what's a God? A God is what you look to on a day-to-day basis for your good, what you hope will provide for you, what you really believe is most important to you, what you look to rescue you, what is life to you, and whatever that is what you're going to worship. That's the thing you're going to think about. That's the thing you're going to put in the most important place in your life. That's what you're going to praise. That's what you're going to get all excited about and actually feel the joy about. And that is what you serve. And we all have one. We all have a God. We all have someone or something we worship. Even if you're here and you don't believe in God, you have a God that you worship. And you can't help that, because as humans, we were made to worship. That's like in our DNA. There's something that we trust. There's something that we find security in. There's something that we live for. There's something that we love most. There's something that we're loyal to. And you can see maybe that I'm trying to use the language Jesus uses in Luke 16, verse 13, to describe service. He says, he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And it's like Jesus is using such big language there, because, I mean, you're like, hate the one and love the other? Wait a second. I'm not sure, because I've had two bosses, and I didn't hate the one and love the other. But Jesus is using big language like that because he's not talking about a normal human employer-employee relationship. He's using this as an illustration to talk about what's God to us. And Jesus assumes there's always something in your life that you're going to look to as God. And this is kind of revolutionary once you understand it. Because it means, as someone said, every moment of life is spiritual. Everything you do is theological. There is never a moment, never a word, action or reaction that's not somehow shaped by whatever has claimed the allegiance of your heart. And so we're all servants serving. We are all, and this is a big word, but maybe it will help, we're all covenantal beings, which means we all enter into a relationship with someone or something, at least in our minds, someone or something that's making promises, and that we trust to keep those promises, that we put our faith in, that we put our hope in for the future, for our good, and that we serve. And obviously that something was meant to be God, the one true God. We were made to live in relationship with God, where he's the one we look to for life, where he's the one we view as the ultimate source of good, where he's the one who's the organizing principle in our life, where he's the one we worship and serve. But after the fall, something has really gone wrong with us. Because the Bible says, and this is Romans 1:25, what we've done is we've turned from worshiping the Creator to worshiping created things instead. And so here's the one true God, the only real God, but we've tried to make a replacement God. Paul says they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. And watch this, because this is about money, but this is about more than just money. It's about life and you and all these good things all around you, because so many of our problems are not coming from bad things, but good things. Because here's this good thing that you want. That's totally fine in its place. And yet you get around it and you do all kinds of weird things and even bad things. And you make terrible, spiritually idiotic decisions. And you're like, why? It's because we were made to enter into a relationship with someone who will be our God. But instead of entering into that relationship with the one person who actually is God, we have this sinful tendency to actually prefer entering into that kind of relationship with something the one true God created instead. We all have this tendency of replacing the Creator with the creature, with things like money and possessions, which is what makes it such a threat. Because if we could just let money be another created thing, it's not going to be a problem. But it becomes a problem because you're broken. And you're tempted to take that created thing and put it in the place of the Creator. Good things become bad things when they become the thing. God has given money to us as a servant, and as long as it's a servant, it's fine, money. But you have to understand, we are happy to let this servant become our master. It's actually weird. And we put this servant, we exalt this servant all the way up to the place of God. And if we do that, it will destroy us. Because as someone said, money is a good servant, but it's a terrible king. Which is why Jesus says you have to think very carefully about your relationship with it. It is a tool, money. It's a test, and it is a very real spiritual threat. Because in this world, one of the chief competitors to God being God in your life, one of the things that is most likely to steal your devotion away from God is money. Maybe partly because you can see money, you can touch money, you can experience money, you can buy something with money and it will bring you pleasure for a moment. But mostly, I think it's because you think you can control money. You think you're in charge of money. And that's what we like about idols. We don't want money because we want to be ruled by money. We want to rule money. And through money, be the one in charge of our own life. If you think back to the original sin in the garden, what was that? We want to be God. And we want to make our own decisions. And we want to feel like we can decide what's right or wrong. We want to be the one who's in charge. And deep down, we want the world to be about our pleasure, our comfort, our glory. And money is fine with letting you think that. You know, God tells us the truth, but money doesn't. Idols don't mind if you don't know you're worshiping them or that you really are their slave. That's what's funny about money. God, the real God, you have to know he's God. That's important. But money does not mind if you think you're the one who's God over it, because it knows it still owns you anyway. You think you're using money, but if you take this created thing and look to it as if it were the creator, you put money in God's place. You say, money, give me significance. You make me matter. Money, you rescue me. When I'm in trouble, you deliver me. Money, you give me purpose. I exist to have more of you. Money, you give me security. You're the one who makes me feel deep down I'm safe. I guarantee you do that, you're not going to be using money anymore. Money's going to be using you. Someone has said this is one of the cruelest tricks of idolatry. What we think we have under control is at that moment in the process of enslaving us. Our desires for physical things twist into needs. And when they do, we become completely convinced we cannot live without them. Which again is part of what makes money so dangerous, why it's a threat. We can't just let money be money. We're so tempted to make money a god. And once money's our god, the one who actually is God isn't, and we may not even know it. We may not even know it. We may still be showing up thinking we're worshiping God. But God says, here's the deal. You cannot serve God and money. Like, it's not an option. It's not possible. Which means that we have to evaluate. If money is this dangerous, I think the second thing to ask is, how can you evaluate whether or not you're in danger? Because obviously there are very few followers of Jesus who would admit that they're actually servants of money. And that's just actually true across the board. Most greedy people don't think they're greedy. I suppose maybe the world's getting so warped now, greed is good or something, but most greedy people won't admit they're greedy, which is why Jesus says back in Luke 12:15, take care and be on your guard against all greed. You have to watch out, you have to take care, you have to guard yourself from greed, because it's easy to be greedy and not even know it. And I think that's partly because it can be a little less obvious than some other sins. It's idolatry, but as I think I've said before, if I'm bringing a Buddha to church, most of you are going to notice. You know, if I'm rubbing the Buddha's belly while we're singing Amazing Grace, it's going to be awkward. And if I come up here to preach and I take out my little Buddha, put it on a stand, most of you are going to be offended, because that kind of idolatry is easy to identify. But Satan has gotten subtle, and it's not like serving money means you've set up a shrine for it in your house, put $1 there, and feed it a banana every day. This is more an idol of the heart, which makes it more difficult to identify in our lives, but it's just as dangerous, if not more. And so I thought I could give you some places to help evaluate which master you're really serving. Like, use this verse, evaluate your life. First of all, what do you think about when you don't have anything else to think about? So I'm talking about what you think about most. What's on repeat in your mind? Maybe a way to ask would be, what keeps you up at night thinking about and planning for? Micah was a prophet in the Old Testament. He describes greedy people as devising wickedness and working evil on their beds. And when the morning dawns, he says they perform it. This is what they do on their downtime. You know, when they're not working and they're supposed to be relaxing, people who are serving money are thinking about more ways to make money for the sake of making more money for themselves. Another way, I suppose, to ask the same question from another angle is, what do you worry about? There's a funny phrase in 2 Corinthians 11 where Paul says he faces the daily pressure of anxiety for all the churches. And what he's saying is he can't stop thinking about the spiritual good of other people, which makes sense for a servant of Christ. That's what he worries about. The servant of money, on the other hand, faces the daily pressure of anxiety about his financial condition. It's not you're automatically a servant of money if you're concerned about your financial situation. Obviously, there are crises in life and concerns necessary. That's what Paul means by anxiety. But sinful anxiety, worry over money, is different. It's that ache in your gut. It's that hopeless, negative, grumbling, kind of repetitive thinking. It's like a dog with a bone. A dog doesn't chew everything, hopefully, but he has a bone, and he just goes after that. And we have thoughts like that are our bone that we chew on. And if we look at those thoughts, we can get an idea of what we really worship. Second, what do you want most? If you want financial prosperity more than God's glory, that's a sign you're serving the wrong master. If you were to complete the sentence, if only blank, then I would be happy, what exactly would you say? What's your expectation? What's your hope? 1 Timothy 6:9 says, but those who want to be rich fall into temptation. And in verse 10, it describes the love of money as a craving. So it's not just like this would be nice. This is a lust. There are certain things that are preferences. I would prefer this and not that. And then there are other things that are more like demands. I'll give all this other stuff up, but this is what I long for. If this doesn't happen, then I'm upset. I have the right to sin. And so we might say, which bothers you more, the thought of being poor or sinning? Or when do you get most impatient? When you get a bad deal? Or when you feel like someone's ripping you off? Or you don't think you're getting as much as you deserve? To put it more positively, what excites you? What would get your heart actually racing this morning? What could happen that would bring you the greatest pleasure, the most delight? Paul's a positive example of what it means to serve Jesus and not money. And one of the places you see what it means is in the prison epistles. Those are the letters he wrote while he was in jail for Jesus. And one of my favorites is Philippians. As Paul is in prison for preaching Jesus, which is obviously a pretty poor place to be, what's he wanting? He tells us in Philippians 1:20. It's my eager expectation and hope that Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or death. When our eager expectation and hope is more about getting out of prison, more about our earthly circumstances changing than it is about Jesus being honored, that's an indication we may be serving the wrong master. Look at what you want. When something in your life becomes an idol, you'll sacrifice for it. You'll spend time for it that you wouldn't spend for other things. You'll think about it. It's like, somebody who won't spend extra time, like I have no time for spiritual study, but that same person has all kinds of time for this. That's a sign of idolatry. You get angry when someone blocks you from getting it and messes with it. You'll build your schedule around it. Like, what do you actually build your schedule around? You'll protect it. You'll defend it at all costs. You'll justify it. Third, what do you talk about? Specifically, what do you complain about? What is it that makes you pity yourself? Feel like you have it worse than other people? I guess another question might be, what do you boast about? Another question we could put a different way is, what do you pity other people for? That's usually, sometimes it's connected to what you think is God. What makes you feel like, I've got this? What makes you feel rich, secure, prosperous? When money is an idol, we feel insecure and inferior when we don't have it, and secure and superior when we do. Is there something that makes you feel like you're a little better than others? We could go one step further and ask, when you talk sinfully, like you're yelling or you're gossiping or you're muttering under your breath, what are you yelling, gossiping, and muttering about? I often think when I'm discipling or counseling, as someone's beginning to get upset about something, now we're on to something. We're getting there. It's like coming into a room and the person has hidden an idol in their closet, and as long as you're not near that closet, they're like the world's nicest people. But once you start getting near that closet door, they start freaking out because they don't want you to find it. Finally, what do? The language Jesus uses back in verse 16 is serve. When pressure comes into your life and you have to make a decision, who tells you what to do? You're in this situation where there's something that you could do which would honor Jesus, and there's something that you could do that would help you financially, and money's telling you one thing and Jesus is telling you another, whose voice do you listen to? What are you doing for your kids would be another question. What do you want for them most? What scares you the most for them and their future? There's a sad passage in Ezekiel, another Old Testament prophet, where God says to Ezekiel, listen to this, he says, "As for you, son of man, your people who talk together about you by the walls and at the doors of the houses say to one another, each to his brother, 'Come and hear what is the word from the Lord.'" Which doesn't sound bad, right? That sounds awesome. Here are people excited about hearing God's word. And they come to you as people come, and they sit before you as my people, and they hear what you say. But listen, they will not do it. For with lustful talk in their mouths they act. Their heart is set on their gain. And behold, you are to them like one who sings lustful songs with a beautiful voice and plays well on an instrument, for they hear what you say, but they will not do it. You're like, all you are, Ezekiel, is there for entertainment. Because money is their master at the end of the day. What are you willing to disobey God for? That's your idol. And that idol, I'm not being mean up here. That I'm being kind. That idol will disappoint you and destroy you. And if you don't deal with that idol, it will lead you away from God, no matter how often you come to church. And you'll be like, I don't understand. Like Isaiah 58, I'm fasting, you're not hearing it. And I'm worshiping, and I'm just not, nothing seems to be this. And if you don't deal with that idol, for God, all this stuff you're doing is not really better than entertainment. If you think like an unbeliever, want like an unbeliever, talk like an unbeliever, and act like an unbeliever, you're going to be as miserable as an unbeliever. Because you're worshiping the same God. That's one big reason you have to think about your relationship with money, like on a day-to-day basis. Your habits of life, your habits of thought. It could be an idol. Is it an idol? But how do we deal with it if it is? That's third. How do we deal with this threat? And I think the first obvious answer would be to recommit yourself to actually believing God. There's a great passage in Hebrews chapter 13. He says, you can look at it sometime. He says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Which is like, okay, that sounds great. Why? For he has said, God has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So what's the contrast? Don't love money. Why? For God has promised he's always with you. And that's an insight. Because look, why do people love money? Why do they get so weird about money that they'll do all these crazy things for money? You have to get to the root. And the root for a lot of people is that they believe money. They believe in money. They have confidence in money. Money makes them feel secure. But why would you feel the need to put your trust in money for security if you really believed the God who created the universe, who has power over all things, is for you and with you and seeking your good? You wouldn't feel that compulsion. We're always putting our faith somewhere. And if we're not actively putting our faith in God, we're putting our faith somewhere else. And so when an idol's exposed in your life, we see there's something controlling us besides God. It's important to ask, what am I not believing this moment about God and the gospel? And here he says, when you're greedy, your life is controlled by money, you're not believing God's always with you and seeking your good. So it's like back when I was young and I was afraid to speak in public. I told you this before. And I would actually shake, and it would control me. I would do things differently, not to speak in front of people. And I had to ask, what am I not believing? And what I wasn't believing was justification by faith. I wasn't believing the importance of God, all kinds of things. And to overcome that idol, I had to focus on the promises of God and preach the promises of God to myself and cry out to God, please help me believe what I say I believe at church. That's the positive. What do you do if you see greed? Believe. The flip side of that is that you actually need to repent, because this is sin. And biblically, it's a big sin. It's idolatry. And idolatry is like one of the biggies. It's a big deal. And when we see idolatry in other people's lives, it's obvious that it's a big deal. When we read in the Old Testament about the Israelites creating that golden calf, we're like, those people deserve judgment. That's terrible. But if we're worshiping this idol in our heart, there's not really a difference between us and them with that golden calf. And we need to come before God and not make excuses and call it what it is and honor God by asking him for forgiveness. I am greedy, God. In spite of how good you are and how gracious you've been to me, I've taken this good thing and I've used it as an excuse not to believe you. And I don't believe your promises. Please forgive me. I believe money, a piece of paper, more than I believe you. And then you've got to fight. You've got to fight. Back in Colossians 3, he says, put to death what's earthly in you, and he names greediness. Put to death greed. And that means part of repenting is going to be fighting against this sin. Like we're talking to the death. And we know that with other kinds of sins. Imagine you've got this guy who's like, I want to be faithful to my wife. And yet, when he's around attractive ladies, he flirts with them. And what would you say he needs to do? You would say, you need to stay away. You need to be clear about your boundaries. You need to be on guard, man. And especially if she starts flirting back with you, you don't stay there. Run. And that's the way greed is with us. Greed is constantly flirting with us. It seems like an attractive lady. And if we want to be faithful to God, and yet greed is constantly flirting with us, we can't flirt back if we're going to stay pure. We've got to believe, we've got to repent, and we've got to fight. I will not commit adultery with money. It's a spiritual adultery. And I won't be unfaithful to Jesus who bought me. And one specific way to fight is to be careful to speak about the value of things the way God does. James, he says to poor people, he says, you need to brag, boast about your high position. So believers who don't have much money need to be careful that they don't start speaking of themselves as if they didn't have much. We really had to work on that when we lived in South Africa. Like, don't use the world's evaluation of you. Don't think that's the real evaluation. Because you're a Christian and you're going to heaven and you're going to be glorified. And James says believers who do have much, on the other hand, the rich brother should boast in his humiliation. In other words, if you're poor or you're rich and you're a Christian, you're going to be tempted to speak about yourself the way the world does. If I'm poor, I don't have much. My life is so hard. If I'm rich, I'm important. I've got it. This is just, I'm so much better. And James is saying you have to make sure you're valuing what God values. Give stuff the value it deserves. Humiliation, being humbled before God, is way more valuable than what car you drive. And if you want to be rich, choose riches that will last forever, right? But speaking truth like that is harder than you might think because we're living in a world that's filled with liars. And our heart is a liar. And that's why we have to be so careful that we speak truth about the value of things. It's kind of like in my life, I've had a lot of cars. And the car I have now is really nice. But I've had so many cars throughout the years that weren't amazing. I remember one car in particular. It was all dented. Couldn't even get the hood to go all the way down. And sometimes I would look at that car and I would think, oh, how nice it would be to have a better looking car. And that part was true. It would have been nice. And it is. But the thing is, then the lies can start coming in. And I start imagining, like, if only I had a Jeep Wrangler or something. And at that moment, I have to say, no, what's true is that another car would be nice. But that other car is going to get dented. It's going to get old. It's not going to satisfy the way these lies are telling me. And so it's fine to want, but it's delusional to worship. Are you hearing me? You kind of have to relate to money and stuff like you would someone you know who's a habitual liar. I don't know if you've ever had a habitual liar in your life where you realize this person just constantly lies. Like they just don't even know. So how do you have to find out, how do you eventually have to relate to them? They may not always be lying to you. You know that. But you kind of always have to be a little suspicious. And that's the way we have to be when it comes to our hearts and money. I'm saying to myself this about this possession or money. But is it even true? What do you do to watch out for greed? Believe, repent, fight, speak truth, and act What would I be thinking right now? What would I be feeling right now? What would I be doing right now if the God of the Bible was actually God? In verse 13, Jesus says, no man can serve two masters. And that's a warning. That's usually the way we take it. But it's also an encouragement. Because you know what? If you're truly serving God, you're not going to be serving money. You can't do it. So daily make choices to structure your life as if Jesus was your master, not money. Look at your daily choices. Do the things I do every day line up with believing that Jesus is my master? Seems kind of obvious, and yet sometimes making those daily choices to serve God is surprisingly difficult, and we have different reasons for that. But you know, one reason many followers of Jesus aren't actually daily serving Jesus nearly as effectively as they could? I think it's sometimes because they don't stop and think honestly and humbly about their actual relationship with money. We're being trained from birth to serve money and to put our trust in money. Thinking of money as belonging to us, being selfish with money, and using money primarily for our own benefit is seen as normal and even wise. Generously giving to people who need it but can't do anything for us right now is seen as either radical or foolish. Almost any time we're close to being convicted about the way we're using money, there's something we can use to justify our behavior and avoid actually changing, which I think is something we really need to pray about, because when Jesus talked about following him, he talked a lot about money. And we need to think about our relationship to it and change if we need to before it's too late, because it's a tool that we can use for Jesus' glory and for our good. It's a test that reveals our character. And while it can be a blessing, it also can be very spiritually dangerous. And because Jesus is really good, and he died for us. And he's not going to give us a warning like this about money if it's not true, and if obeying him and actually doing what he says wouldn't be what's best for us. Let's pray.